I discovered my son wasn't actually mine, but I'd already put him in my will, so I changed it. The blood test results came back on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by a lab technician who had no idea she was about to shatter my entire world into a million pieces. 23 years of believing I was a father, 23 years of scraped knees and bedtime stories, soccer games and college tuition payments, all built on what turned out to be the biggest lie of my life. My ex-wife had been acting strange during our divorce proceedings 6 months earlier, making these weird comments about how I should be grateful for all the years we had together. She kept saying things like maybe it was time for both of us to start fresh, completely fresh, without looking back at anything from our past. The way she emphasized those words made my stomach churn, but I figured it was just her way of dealing with the end of our marriage. The doubts started creeping in when I noticed how different my son looked from me in our recent family photos. Sure, kids don't always look like their parents, but there was something about his facial structure, his mannerisms, even the way he laughed that reminded me of someone else entirely. It reminded me of her old friend from college, the one who used to come around a lot during the early years of our marriage. I convinced myself I was being paranoid, that the stress of the divorce was making me see things that weren't there. But the thoughts kept gnawing at me, especially during those long sleepless nights when I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if everything I thought I knew about my life was actually true. The decision to get the paternity test wasn't easy, and I spent weeks going back and forth about whether I really wanted to know the truth. Part of me figured that ignorance might be bliss, that maybe some secrets were better left buried. But the other part of me, the part that valued honesty above everything else, knew I had to find out once and for all. Getting the test done without my son knowing was surprisingly simple, just a matter of collecting some hair from his brush and sending it off to a lab along with my own sample. The waiting period felt like it lasted forever, and I must have checked my email 100 times a day hoping for results. When the results finally came, they were definitive in the most devastating way possible. 0% probability of paternity. The report stated in cold, clinical language that somehow made the betrayal feel even more brutal. I read those words over and over again, hoping they would somehow change, but they remained stubbornly the same. My first instinct was to call my ex-wife immediately and confront her about the lies she'd been telling for more than 2 decades. I wanted to scream at her, to demand explanations, to make her feel even a fraction of the pain and confusion I was experiencing. But something held me back, maybe because I knew that conversation would change everything forever. Instead, I sat in my car outside the post office where I'd picked up the results, trying to process what this meant for my relationship with the young man I'd raised as my own son. He was about to graduate from college, had plans to get married next year, and still called me every Sunday just to check in and see how I was doing. The financial implications hit me like a ton of bricks when I got home and started looking through my estate planning documents. I'd recently updated my will during the divorce proceedings, making sure my son would inherit everything I'd worked so hard to build over the years. The house, the investment accounts, the life insurance policies, all of it was set to go to him. But now, knowing what I knew, the idea of leaving everything to someone who wasn't actually my biological child felt like the ultimate betrayal of my own blood. I started thinking about my brother's kids, my real nephews and nieces who shared my DNA, and how they'd been essentially written out of my will in favor of someone who had no biological connection to me whatsoever. The rage I felt toward my ex-wife was indescribable, but it was mixed with this profound sadness about the relationship I'd built with my son under false pretenses. Every memory we'd shared, every proud moment I'd experienced watching him grow up, every time I'd bragged about him to my friends and coworkers, all of it felt tainted now. I made an appointment with my lawyer the next week, telling him I needed to make some changes to my estate planning documents. He seemed surprised since we'd just updated everything a few months earlier, but he didn't ask too many questions when I told him it was urgent. Sitting in his office, I explained that I wanted to remove my son as the primary beneficiary, and instead split everything between my brother's children and a few charities I'd always supported. The lawyer raised his eyebrows and asked if I was sure about such a dramatic change, especially since I'd always talked about how proud I was of my son. I couldn't bring myself to explain the real reason for the changes, so I just told him that my priorities had shifted and I wanted to make sure my extended family was taken care of. He made the changes without further questions, and I signed the new documents with a heavy heart but a clear conscience. The hardest part was continuing to act normal around my son, while this secret burned inside me like acid. He'd come over for dinner sometimes, and we'd watch basketball games together just like we always had. But now I found myself studying his face, looking for traces of the man I suspected was his real father. I started avoiding family gatherings because I couldn't stand the way relatives would comment on how much my son and I looked alike, or how he'd inherited my stubborn streak. Every well-meaning comment felt like a knife twisting in my chest, reminding me of the massive deception that had shaped my entire adult life. The worst part was that my son had no idea any of this was happening, and he continued to treat me with the same love and respect he'd always shown. He'd text me articles he thought I'd find interesting, send me photos from his job, and talk about his plans for the future as if nothing had changed. 3 months after changing my will, I got a call from my son saying he and his fiancée wanted to take me out to dinner to celebrate his recent promotion at work. We went to this steakhouse we'd been going to for years, and he spent the whole evening talking about how grateful he was for everything I'd done for him throughout his life. He told me about how his friends at work were always complaining about their relationships with their fathers, but he felt lucky to have someone who'd always been supportive and encouraging. He said he hoped he could be half the father to his own kids someday that I'd been to him. Listening to him talk like that, seeing the genuine love and appreciation in his eyes, I felt this overwhelming wave of guilt about what I'd done with my will. Here was someone who'd brought me nothing but joy and pride for 23 years, and I'd essentially disowned him because of something that was completely out of his control. That night, I couldn't sleep at all, tossing and turning while I thought about the conversation we'd had over dinner. I realized that my anger toward my ex-wife had clouded my judgment and made me punish the wrong person. My son hadn't done anything wrong. He was as much a victim of her deception as I was. I started thinking about all the ways he'd enriched my life over the years, from the time he was a little kid who'd crawl into my lap to read books together, to the teenager who'd come to me for advice about girls and college applications. Blood or no blood, he'd been my son in every way that mattered. The next morning, I called my lawyer again and told him I wanted to change my will back to the way it was before. He seemed confused by all the back and forth, but he scheduled an appointment for later that week to make the revisions. But then something unexpected happened that completely changed everything once again. My ex-wife called me out of the blue, which was strange because we'd barely spoken since the divorce was finalized. She said she needed to talk to me about something important and asked if we could meet for coffee. My heart started racing because I wondered if she somehow knew about the paternity test, or if she decided to come clean about the lies she'd been telling all these years. I agreed to meet her at a cafe downtown, and I spent the entire drive there trying to prepare myself for whatever bombshell she was about to drop. When I walked into the cafe, she looked nervous and fidgety, which was completely unlike her usual composed demeanor. She ordered a coffee with shaking hands and kept avoiding eye contact while we made small talk about the weather and how our son was doing at work. Finally, she took a deep breath and told me she had something to confess that she'd been carrying around for years. She said the guilt was eating her alive, especially now that we were divorced and she didn't have to worry about destroying our marriage anymore. What came next was even more shocking than I'd expected. She told me that shortly after our son was born, she'd had doubts about his paternity and had secretly gotten a DNA test done. But instead of telling me the truth, she decided to keep the secret because she was afraid of losing the life we'd built together. She said she'd convinced herself that it didn't matter because I was such a good father, and our son loved me so much that the biological connection was irrelevant. She thought she was protecting everyone by keeping the truth buried, but the secret had been poisoning her for years. Then she dropped the biggest bombshell of all. She told me that a few months after getting those initial DNA results, she'd had doubts about the accuracy of the test and had gotten a second opinion from a different lab. The second test had come back with completely different results, showing that I was indeed the biological father. She'd been carrying around this uncertainty for over 20 years, never knowing which test was correct and too afraid to get a third opinion because she didn't want to risk destroying our family. She said the stress of not knowing the truth had contributed to the problems in our marriage and had made her feel like she was living a lie. I sat there in complete shock, trying to process what she was telling me. If her second test was accurate, then the test I'd gotten was wrong, and I'd been torturing myself over nothing. But if her test was wrong and mine was right, then she'd been living with the knowledge of her betrayal for decades. She begged me to get another test done, using a different lab than either of us had used before, so we could finally know the truth once and for all. She said she couldn't live with the uncertainty anymore, and that our son deserved to know the truth about his parentage. I felt like I was losing my mind trying to figure out what to believe. Part of me wanted to tell her about the test I'd already gotten, but another part of me was afraid that if I admitted to testing our son without his knowledge, she'd use that against me somehow. We agreed to get a new test done together, this time with our son's knowledge and consent. I dreaded having that conversation with him, but I knew it was the only way to get definitive answers and move forward with some semblance of peace. That evening, I called my son and asked him to come over because I needed to discuss something important with him. When he arrived, I could tell he was worried because I'd sounded so serious on the phone. I explained the situation as gently as I could, telling him about the doubts that had been raised about his paternity and how we needed to get a definitive test done to resolve the uncertainty. I was prepared for him to be angry or hurt, but his reaction surprised me. He said he'd actually wondered about this himself sometimes, especially when people would comment on how different he looked from me. He said he'd noticed some physical similarities between himself and his mother's old friend, the same person I'd been suspicious of. What shocked me most was his maturity about the whole situation. He said that regardless of what the test results showed, I'd always be his father in the ways that mattered most. He said biology was just genetics, but fatherhood was about love, support, and being there for someone when they needed you. We got the test done the next week, and this time I wasn't as anxious about the results because I'd already prepared myself for either outcome. If he was my biological son, then I'd put us both through unnecessary pain over a false positive. If he wasn't, then at least we'd both know the truth and could figure out how to move forward. The results came back showing that I was indeed his biological father, with a 99.9% probability of paternity. The relief I felt was overwhelming, but it was mixed with anger at myself for doubting our relationship and anger at my ex-wife for creating this mess in the first place. My son was relieved too, but he told me something that made me realize how much damage I'd almost done with my will changes. He said he'd always counted on the fact that I'd be there for him and his future family, and knowing that I'd have his back financially gave him the confidence to take risks and pursue his dreams. If I'd gone through with removing him from my will, I would have been taking away that sense of security and support that had been so important to his development as a person. I realized that my knee-jerk reaction to change my estate planning had been driven by hurt and anger rather than rational thinking. I never told him about the will changes I'd made and then reversed, because I didn't want him to know how close I'd come to abandoning him over something that turned out to be false. But the experience taught me a valuable lesson about the importance of not making major decisions when you're emotional and hurt. Looking back on that whole ordeal, I realize how much damage can be done by secrets and lies, even when people think they're protecting others. My ex-wife's decision to hide her doubts about paternity had created years of uncertainty and pain for all of us. But it also taught me that the bonds between family members are stronger than just shared DNA. Even when I thought my son wasn't biologically mine, I couldn't fully disconnect from the love and pride I felt for him. The years we'd spent together had created a relationship that transcended genetics. The experience also made me think about the importance of being careful about estate planning and not making changes based on temporary emotions or uncertain information. I could have caused irreparable damage to my relationship with my son if I died before discovering the truth about his paternity. Now, more than a year later, my relationship with my son is stronger than ever. We've both learned not to take our connection for granted, and we make more of an effort to spend time together and communicate openly about important issues. I've also learned to be more forgiving of my ex-wife's mistakes, understanding that she was trying to protect our family in her own misguided way. The divorce had already ended our marriage, but at least we were able to resolve this issue before it caused permanent damage to our son's relationship with both of us. The whole experience reminded me that family relationships are complicated and that the truth isn't always as simple as it seems on the surface. Sometimes the people we love make mistakes or keep secrets, but that doesn't necessarily mean they don't care about us. I'm grateful that everything worked out in the end, but I'll never forget how close I came to making a decision that would have haunted me for the rest of my life. The lesson I learned is that when it comes to family, it's better to err on the side of love and forgiveness rather than anger and revenge. My son is getting married next month, and I'm proud to be walking him down the aisle as his father in every sense of the word. The uncertainty and pain of those few months seems like a distant memory now, but I know it changed both of us in ways that will last forever. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd never gotten that first paternity test, if I'd just lived with my doubts and suspicions without ever seeking the truth. But I'm glad I did because now I know with certainty that my son is mine, and he knows it too. The experience taught me that the most important relationships in life are worth fighting for, even when they're tested by doubt and uncertainty. Blood may be thicker than water, but love and commitment are thicker than blood.